As you know, my name is Tomeu Estelric. I am the director of the Center for Ignatian Spirituality here at Boston College. As you know, this year we celebrate 500 years of Ignatius' conversion and 400 years of his canonization. With that in mind, I invited 3 generations of Jesuits, a veteran, a middle-aged, and a young Jesuit, to talk about Ignatius, specifically about their personal view of Ignatius and how this has evolved and changed during the years in themselves, and similarly to talk about the Society of Jesus, how also it has evolved and changed over the years in its interpretation and emphasis on Ignatius. As probably you have noticed, there has been a change of names in the presenters. Father Brian Dunkel was supposed to be here today, but his mom passed away last Thursday, and yesterday was her burial. So from here, our condolences, prayers, and best wishes to him and his family. I also want to thank Father Sayo Pil, who is the rector of St. Mary's Hall, for stepping in the last minute, wholeheartedly and with enthusiasm, how he is. So I cannot thank him enough for his generosity. Finally, let me not introduce our 3 speakers, John Pauls, Sayo Pil, and Paul Harmon, because they are going to introduce themselves just in a second, okay? But I just wanted to let you know a little bit the questions that I asked them to go through so that I can disappear, sit somewhere, and then just be a spectator. So I asked them to talk, first of all, in the first round, about themselves and to explain in what moment they are at in the formative scheme of the Society of Jesus. Second, what attracted them to Ignatius before joining the Society of Jesus? Third, once in the order, how the image of Ignatius changed or evolved. 4, what is their favorite passage in Ignatius' life? What is the passage that speaks more to them? For what reason? And finally, what is their favorite anecdote or even joke about Ignatius? Then, what I asked them to do is to, after this first introduction, what I asked them to do is to look to Ignatius from a more institutional point of view. And I asked them 5 questions. First, how the image of Ignatius had changed in the Society of Jesus during their lifetimes. How would they define that evolution? Is there something that they miss from the past or old representations of Ignatius? Do they celebrate or see positively any of the changes? And finally, is there something that they would like to change for future generations about how Ignatius is seen and interpreted? So their participation will last for about 40 minutes. And then we will have a few minutes for questions and answers. So join me with a round of applause to welcome our 3 panelists, John Pauls, Father Sayo Pil, and Father Paul Harmon.
Good afternoon. I'm going to go first, representing the formation icon of Ignatius, I guess. My name is John Pauls. I was born and raised in Connecticut, and I joined the Jesuits of the Central and Southern Province of the United States. I've been in the society 10 years. I've taken vows for 8, so the first 2 years were novitiate, and I had vows for 8 years. And I'm approaching priesthood next summer. So I'm going to give you, the most recent take on Ignatius generationally. I met the Jesuits when I was working overseas, and my first encounter, I had no idea who Ignatius was, except maybe encountering him in a litany at a particular devotion at some point in my life. So the first time I really encountered him was through a Jesuit, David Brown, who worked as a Vatican physicist and astrophysicist in Rome. And it was so intriguing to me that a priest would be a specialist in science. That was the first thing that grabbed me. As I would come to learn later, after I entered, that would be one way that the principle of God in all things cashes itself out in Jesuit life, in very interesting missions and ways of study and apostolate. And so my introduction to Ignatius was through a living Jesuit who embodied that. And then my first encounter with Ignatius himself was kind of some sketches of his autobiography, some isolated stories, and his rules for discernment. And that was probably my first point of contact or attraction to the society, was this practicality behind his spirituality. I love the saints, but some of the saints seemed a little lofty for myself, unattainable. And I encountered in Ignatius a different take on how to live the Christian life. And in particular, as I was in spiritual direction and discernment around my vocation, his rules for discernment of spirits gave me a way forward that answered some questions and helped me hear the voice of God. And I was very attracted to that because up to that point of my life, my prayer life was not as alive as I have come to see is important now. And Ignatius kind of opened that up for me. And so that was kind of my first introduction and attraction to Ignatius, was this practical spirituality and answers and a way of approaching God that helped me encounter God that was very nourishing. So I entered in 2011, and then I encountered a much richer and more detailed experience of Ignatius through various sources, retreats, meeting other Jesuits. And so one of the ways that my encounter with Ignatius deepened was around his story at Montserrat, where he's just had his conversion. He leaves his hometown, he goes to Montserrat, which is the spiritual shrine in his country. And I resonated with that. He's looking for God. He's had an experience of God. Where does he go? The spiritual shrine that's close by, Montserrat. And I didn't realize that till I'd been there. I'm like, wow, of course. I do that too. When I've answers or looking for answers from God, where in my culture do people find God? And I go there. And he did that. And there, he offered his sword away. And he says in his autobiography that he desired to become a knight for God, and he offered his sword, which represented for him this idealistic picture of wanting to be a soldier and a knight for a king or for the world. And when I first read that, I didn't give it much mind, but I keep coming back to that moment, especially in my generation, which is, I think, rightfully concerned with questions of identity in a variety of different ways. Ignatius's encounter with God there is a real offering of his identity to the Lord, and a willingness and a risk to receive back an identity he didn't know the full ramifications of at that point. And I find that moment very touching, very tender, very bold. And I connect it for me with the Suscipe prayer, take, Lord, and receive. I don't think that came from that moment in Ignatius' life, but I read those together as an offering of identity, of who he was, and a taking a risk to receive back something unknown and hopefully beautiful. And so that moment around identity, around an offering, around taking the risk, has been a moment that's deepened for me in my formation in the society. I found it to connect with young people when I've taught in high schools and shared Ignatian spirituality, and it's something that I continue to look at the life of Ignatius through. How is he giving up an identity? How is he receiving a new one? And where are the struggles and joys in that? And that's been really nourishing for me, I guess, in my context and formation. A favorite anecdote I have from Ignatius, he just became our first Father General in the 1540s, and he was in Rome, and his Italian was terrible. And so one of the younger men at the time said, hey, whose Italian was very good, hey, I'll come listen to you on a street corner when you preach, especially to children and to people on the street, and I'll correct your Italian, and at the end I'll give you a little sheet of where you can get better. And Ignatius says, perfect. He's always trying to get better, trying to be very practical in concrete ways. So he goes out and he preaches a sermon, and the guy sits in the back and he starts writing down mistakes. And he realizes very quickly that Ignatius is making so many mistakes he can't keep up with it. So he puts his pad down, he puts his pen down, he just waits. And Ignatius finishes, and Ignatius comes up to him and says, okay, how can I get better? And Pedro, the Jesuit, says, where to begin? It was so terrible. He said it sounded more like Spanish than Italian. And Ignatius's response to that was something I find very moving. He said, Pedro, what shall we do for God? And Pedro Ribadeneira takes that as Ignatius's zeal. Well, this is what I have, I offer to God, and I keep going. But I read that as a sign of Ignatius's humility. He was not good at Italian. He was not an eloquent preacher. And he's okay being reminded of that, and he's okay going out and continuing to offer this poor linguistic way of speaking to try and reach people. And he was Father General at the time. And so this picture of Ignatius as a humble man, even in a position of authority and power, was very moving to me, and continues to be one of my favorite stories of him, both for its humor and what it says about the man. So I think with that, I'll pass.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Tomeo for asking me to be here, even if it's to fill in. But one of the things I realized was he said, I want a middle-aged Jesuit. I was shocked. I was shocked. But also, as a Jesuit, accept all kinds of things and grow from it. My current job is I'm the superior, the rector of St. Mary's, the Jesuit community. I'm on the south side of Commonwealth Avenue. And I'm also in the physics department. I'm associate professor of physics. I have, due to the kindness of the dean, I have been able to take a bit of a course reduction, and I only teach in the second semester. I've continued during this time and through the time I've been here at Boston College, which is 17 years. I'm right now doing research, and a focus of my research has been working on meteorites. And I work as a colleague and a collaborator with the Vatican Observatory. A number of you, I believe, were here when Brother Guy Consolmagno spoke a few weeks ago, and when he said that, finding God in all things is a really important part of the Jesuit way. And I think in some ways, that is one of the things that's kind of attracted me to the society. Trying to find God. Every one of us is in some ways a pilgrim. Ignatius called himself a pilgrim. And there's a kind of a searching every kind of day along your life, and as time goes on, for trying to serve God, to enable, to use your talents to do those things. I felt as I entered the Maryland province, I've spent most of my time actually in what was the New England province. Now it's from Maine to Georgia is one province, the United Eastern Province. So in some ways, my plans have had to be revised all along the way. I actually didn't expect to study physics to come to university professorship. I thought I was going to be working in parishes or in a retreat house or a high school. And it was through the direction of a provincial that said, well, what studies would you like to do? And I realized I was not being asked to do what I thought I was going to be asked to do. But nonetheless, there's a certain sense of calling. I was initially attracted to the society because it was a long formation program, not because it was a short formation program. And I thought, well, maybe I'll have enough time in order to discern really what God wants of me to do. And somehow I had this idea about serving the church, and it was very ill-defined or poorly defined. I had an idea that perhaps I wanted to be a missionary. And I spent at least some of my time, I spent a summer in China trying to discern that. And clearly, I can tell you, discernment works. Because after a summer, God said, you're not going to stay here. You really need to go move on to something else. What I would say is that what drew me to the society is I had a number of spiritual directors when I was a student at the University of Scranton. One of them was George Aschenbrenner. George Aschenbrenner, for my senior year, was my spiritual director, and he had me he challenged me to pray in a certain way. and to understand and to grow, which I understand now is kind of Ignatian prayer and discernment. And so the conversations, I think, drew me in closer to knowing what I was to do and how I was to serve God. I've had, in some ways, a normal kind of formation. Novitiate, 2 years philosophy. I was at Fordham University, studied philosophy. My background's engineering. I got an engineering degree. I worked 2 years designing circuit boards and computers, and I worked for 2 years, paid off my college loans, and then entered. I really hadn't studied much philosophy, so I got to know philosophy a bit. I had a wonderful time in Regency, where I was able to teach physics and chemistry, and had just a lot of fun. Perhaps I was having so much fun, I thought I'll be actually engaged in the third year, and my rector said, no, theology awaits you after 2 years. So always kind of changes. And I loved theology. I never had the opportunity really to study much theology before, so it was a great opportunity. I went to Berkeley, California, and I studied for 4 years. And there, kind of discovering my own voice in terms of trying to be a minister, the best minister I could be. We all have talents. I would say is that all along the way, discernment has been in prayer, and people helping me, mentors, spiritual directors have mentored me to try to find what is the next thing. And sometimes provincials have intervened. I want to give you 2 vignettes about Ignatius that are important to me. The first has to do with, it's important to know that Ignatius 3 times was imprisoned. The Inquisition is involved in all these things. But what's important is that last time he was imprisoned in Salamanca, he was there for 22 days. Imagine a 22-day stay in a medieval prison. Not a good scene. But what that didn't do is it didn't defeat Ignatius. It made him realize that he had to change his life. One of the reasons why he's imprisoned is he was teaching without a license to teach theology, even though he was kind of teaching in a humble way, simple things to children. But what he did is he used that experience, a very unpleasant experience in being in prison and being accused of all kinds of bad things, that he would then go and to become a master of theology at Paris, the best place in the world to do that. And so that kind of image, I think, is really using an opportunity which may be painful or challenging in order to do something which is really positive. The second image I'd like to use is Ignatius had many defeats. It wasn't only a cannonball that broke his leg, but he wanted to be a missionary, and he wanted to be someone who was going to take over the world, win back Palestine for Christ. When he goes to the Holy Land, he's told by a Franciscan, kind of provincial, that he's to leave. He can't go there because he can't be protected. He's a nobleman, and he's going to be ransomed. He's going to be captured and ransomed, and they didn't want him there. So that's in some ways his second defeat. He's had many other defeats. But what Ignatius did was he turned that opportunity to take Palestine back for Christ, and he got back, and he then he offered his life and the lives of others to serve the papacy, to do something good for God. And those 2 things touched me very much because they're very human things. They're a defeat which turns into a victory.
In introducing us, Tomeo very gently referred to me as a veteran. That's a kind word for old. I'm old. There's a 50-year gap between John and me. And you notice that John was able to speak and remember all the points, a lot of pieces of paper. I will be clinging to my notes. The truth is that I knew next to nothing about Ignatius before I entered the society. What drew me to the society were a group of Jesuits who taught me. I found them to be happy men, hardworking men, great teachers. And as a young teenager at Fairfield Prep in Connecticut, I said, I think I'd like to do that. and that was it. I knew a little bit about Francis Xavier. I knew just a little more about the North American martyrs because their gruesome tortures are always of interest to young male teenagers. And I knew a little bit about St. Robert Bellarmine because he was the patron saint of Fairfield, where I encountered the Jesuits. Ignatius, apart from the name, and I knew that he was a saint, I would have drawn a blank if you asked me any details. When I entered the novitiate a long time ago, 67 years ago, to be exact, I read some biographies of Ignatius, but again, I was more attracted to some of the early companions of Ignatius than I was to Ignatius himself. It was only after the personal experience of the spiritual exercises and then annual retreats that I personally began to wonder what was the religious experience of the man behind the text. And that started a long interest on my part. Both John and Cy have mentioned the so-called autobiography of Ignatius. When I entered the society, that had been translated into English, but it received little or no attention from any of the novice master or any of the superiors. It was not even required reading, whereas today information, it is a very important document. I think if you had asked most Jesuits 60 or 70 years ago what they thought of the autobiography or reminiscences of Ignatius, they would have stared blankly at you. It was simply not widely known at the time. Once I was a Jesuit, as I said, I became interested in who was the individual and what was the individual's experience, spiritual experience, behind the exercises. And over time, that of course drew me to know more about the actual life and times of St. Ignatius. Even before I was technically an old man, what most impressed me about Ignatius were the circumstances of his death. Ignatius died in 1556. Already 5 or 6 years earlier, some of his companions knew he was ill. This was an ill man. But the summer of 1556 was especially hot and uncomfortable in Rome, where he was. What they called the Roman fever apparently was actually a variant of malaria. And so in the house where Ignatius lived, there were several Jesuits who were quite ill. They took Ignatius early in the month of July to a farm, just so that he'd have better air. But he was back in Rome on July 27th. The last letters had been written, and he asked to see a doctor. He asked, a sign that he knew he was ill on July 29th. The doctor came, but the doctor was actually more concerned about Father Diego Lainez, who was the second general of the society, and some of the others. On the 30th of July, Ignatius said to his longtime trusted companion, Juan Alfonso Polanco, would you go and get the Pope's blessing for me and for Father Lainez? And amazingly, Ignatius left the decision whether to go or not. He left it to Polanco, but amazingly, Polanco said, He thought, no, I don't have to do it at this moment. And so he did not go. It was not a great distance. The house where they lived was actually close by where the Pope lived in the city of Rome at that time. So it would have been a little bit longer than going over to St. Mary's Hall, but not much. And so Ignatius died. He died quietly in the night. There was a brother who was in the same room, was sleeping in the bed nearby, and he remembered that he had been agitated a little bit earlier and kind of groaning, but then was very quiet. So he dies with no one around, no last words, no loving companions speaking with him, comforting him, not having finished the constitutions, which were a big project, having made no provision for who was going to succeed him, without the final rites of the church, and without, which would have been very important for Ignatius, without the blessing of the Pope. The late Jesuit Cardinal Henri de Lubac wrote a book some years ago called Catholicism. And in the book he says, a person is enlightened not when he or she has an idea, but when someone looks at her or at him with love. I'm very moved by that line, and I think that Ignatius dying truly let go, before he died, of everything he had dreamt on his convalescent bed at Loyola many years ago, all the things he would do for God. And he did. He went to even extremes sometimes trying to do them. But he let go of all of that, and he let go in saying to Polanco, you make the decision whether to get the Pope's blessing. He let go of all, and that's when I think you have the final conversion of Ignatius, that he just let himself look at the face that was looking at him with great love. To me, that's the most powerful moment in the life of Ignatius, his last moment. I do not have a funny joke about Ignatius, but I have a favorite story, and it was told to me by Father Vincent, the late Father Vincent O'Keefe, whom I had great admiration for and with whom I lived for a few years. And when he was Father Arupe's general assistant in Rome, he went with Father Arupe once to a convent of sisters, and the sisters were, when they arrived, were all excited and much commotion and so forth. And Vinnie O'Keefe, who knew Italian very well, heard one of the sisters say quietly, "Oh, the Jesuits, they know everything, but nothing else."
It's so true.
Now I have to start on the second question for no man. I think the institutional image of Ignatius has been greatly enriched over my lifetime in the society, my 67 years. And that, in large part, is due to the scholarship that has ensued. We still lack a complete biography of Ignatius the way we have for Francis Xavier. We have a 4-volume classic work on Francis Xavier, written by a German Jesuit who attributed his health, he had been very ill, to Francis Xavier. And he did magnificent research. And actually it's some of his research that helps us to know a little bit more about Ignatius. But much more is being done on Ignatius now, so I find that exciting. I suppose the old image was of the military saint, or the soldier saint, which morphed into the pilgrim saint, and I think that is in the process of morphing. I sometimes think, now that I'm old, that the so-called autobiography, which is so well known, especially by younger Jesuits, that at some future date that might be supplemented by, we now have the English translation of the biography that one of his own first companions wrote, Ribadeneira, and some of the other documents. And I think that will be a great help and very exciting. And I think that cannonball moment, important as it clearly was, will also maybe recede a bit in the light of some of the other great moments in the life of our founder. I've been happy with all the changes because I think most of the changes that I've seen, both in the formation work in the society and in the documents of the society, have been the work of the Spirit, moving not only in Jesuits but in the church and in the people. Just about a month ago, I participated with Kathy Marr on a panel on really about some of the women who are very influential in Ignatius's life. And I think more and more is going to be written about those women too, and that will become available, all to the good of our understanding of who this man was and who helped him become the man that he was.
Great, thank you. Ignatius. Perhaps when I entered the society, this is a helpful kind of point, is when I entered the society, it was 1984, and the society was almost suppressed. Actually, there was, Father Rupe had been kind of removed. Father Vino O'Keefe, who Paul just mentioned, was kind of asked to get out of Rome. And I remember arriving at the novitiate and realizing that there was something not quite right, because we had an appointed person as the head of the society. I didn't quite know what was really going on. It sounded like politics to me. It probably was. But there was some kind of discomfort on the part of the people. So, Ignatius, the society has been one of the few orders that's ever been suppressed. We came to it very close, to kind of suppression or repression, have you. But what miraculously happened the first time the society was suppressed was it came back. And I think the reason I mention this is that a person like Pedro Rupe, who was the general who was sick at the time and was really kind of put aside by John Paul II, there was a sense that Ignatius suffered in his own life with some successes, but also many failures, and learned from those failures. And I think, for me, is that the society has over the last 30 or almost 40 years has grown in perhaps a different way, serving the church. I think it's a very important kind of point. I think Ignatius gathered that small group of friends around him. It really was after coming back and kind of offering himself to the Pope to somehow to serve God through the church. And the details are in some ways left to circumstance, grace, money, opportunity, and prayer. I think that's perhaps what Ignatius saw, and I think also what someone like Pedro Rupe saw. So how has it changed? Well, guess what? I never thought in my life that we'd have a Jesuit pope. I mean, it's even in the constitutions or, in the kind of the documents of the society that Jesuits will never be bishops. They can never aspire to be bishops. And you have to say no, when someone is approaching you to do that. Well, we live in a day, which I never thought I would see, where you have someone who embodies in so many ways many of the wonderful qualities of a pastor, who's also a brilliant politician as well, and trying to be a pastor of the church, which is in all these countries and all over the world, and he speaks to climate change. His Laudato Si is something, an encyclical which he wrote, had written, which will not only be read in these last number of years, but for the next 100 years, people will be dealing with the occasion of, did we implement it enough? And also is the fact that he actually took, he praised, the Orthodox Patriarch who had also been working on this in an underway. So he was perhaps differently than John Paul II, but was very ecumenical in the work that he's been doing. I would say is that Francis serves the church. His love of the poor, if any of you have read any of the biographies of Francis, you realize his kind of conversion to serving the poor as the Bishop of Buenos Aires is rather dramatic and beautiful. It's touching, the kind of people he wanted to help. And I think he is in some ways an image and symbol, but also a product of the kind of work that the society has wanted to do. It's representative of that early Jesuit, Ignatius, who was teaching children. I'll admit to you something that I don't rarely say. I can't teach children. They drive me crazy. They keep on moving, and they're asking questions. But the fact that Ignatius could desire to teach children, I think he actually saw that as probably the most ascetic thing he could possibly do. Certainly would be for me. I thank God that my superiors have not asked me to teach little children. It's a great grace. They see my limitations. I see Ignatius in the work and the missionaries that he sent to in the early parts of the world to really mission territories. But I see also that, and today we see that Ignatius' life and work is in places like Boston College and other universities, but throughout the world. One of the things that I find most inspiring about this is that as the Spirit moves the society, it moves different people at different times in the society to join. Today, there's a huge decline. I'm in part of that decline of people in North America, Jesuits, who are fewer and fewer in number. But if that were only the story, it would be really tragedy. However, the success of that story, or the positive side of that story, is in Vietnam, in a place which is persecuted in Christianity, and in places like India, which is a primarily Hindu place, the society is rising. The society is putting great efforts in to get people to do formation. Getting formators to actually have people come. So I would say is that as time goes on, we see the Spirit move. I would never expect Francis to be Pope, and he is. And so we can't outdo or underestimate the Holy Spirit. That's why I keep on praying for vocations of the society, that people would enter, to do the work of the society. Perhaps it's the realization that the people in Vietnam are receiving the prayers of the Holy Spirit as understand, and I have to be humble enough to know that I will be part of a society here that will change, not diminish so much, but change in how we do things. I'm going to just close by saying that after studies, I did a postdoc at Los Alamos National Lab, and I was in the desert in New Mexico. And my spiritual director called me one day and said, I have someone asking me to do the Annotation 19 retreat. And I said, oh, well, that's wonderful. I thought he was just going to tell me some of the work he's doing. What he said, though, he said, they live very close to you, and I want you to do it. I had already kind of had a full plate. I was working in the parish on Sunday, all day on Sunday. Saturday, I had to take off. And I was very hesitant. And I said, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have enough kind of talent to do this. What happened, though, I met this person. We worked for every week for 6 weeks. And I had realized that this person really needed the exercises. They didn't quite understand. They kind of understood bits and parts of it. But they were ready. And over the next, how many weeks we were engaged in the exercise. That's the best work I did. I was there, postdoc. That pales in comparison because I realized how the Spirit was engaged in this person's life. And I was like the umpire, seeing how the Holy Spirit was impacting this person's life. So I think things like the Annotation 19 retreat, opening ourselves to the Spirit of God, will change our lives. We may not know where we're going, but that's not so much because we're pilgrims on the road with God.
Thanks, gentlemen. It's great. I'll say in terms of changes, I think you'll see within my span that the changes have been a lot smaller, but hopefully you can see over time. The first one is the constitutions. In my time in the society, when I first entered, the constitutions were not presented as a book of prayer, so that would be the juridical document of the society. It was much more about the spiritual exercises. And in my 10 years in the society, there's been a huge effort to recover the constitutions as not only a greater understanding of Ignatius himself, but as a spiritual document. And that's been a big change for me, which has been a real grace. So retreats being offered, books being written, talks being given, both within the society and then slowly starting to make its way outside. I think the second thing is greater contextualization of Ignatius. He's not this God's gift to the world that descends out of heaven, but he is very much a product of his time. Yes, unique, yes, creative. And so what does that mean? Well, books are being translated of works that he was reading that people are starting to see, like the life of Christ. Oh, this is where his contemplative method partially came from. I think that's a good thing. I think to see Ignatius as a product of his time, not reduce it to that, but to see, wow, he's pulling from different things, I think gives me more creativity in my own time today. And then the translation of other biographies, like we do show and tell in my generation, the Jesuits. So Pedro Ribadeneira, one of Ignatius' contemporaries, this biography wasn't available in English when I first entered. It came out, I think, 4 years after I entered. And his final chapter, chapter 5, is virtues that he saw Ignatius embody. That's very different than the autobiography. And it makes Ignatius, I think, a little bit more human and a little bit more relatable. And Ignatius was very humble. He didn't want to talk about that stuff. And Ribadeneira really fills out, I think, a picture of Ignatius that, for me, when I first entered, wasn't available unless you knew certain languages. And so I think that's a really good thing in my time in the society. In terms of myths, when I read older works in the society, I'm talking 200-300 years, there's a great stress on devotions in schools, in Jesuit formation. And I hesitate to say the word lost because they never were lost, but I think the emphasis on those decreased for a time, and you're slowly starting to see a recovery of it. One Jesuit provincial said, a spirituality with handles. And I think there's a desire in my generation and younger for that, and I think the Jesuits used to be all about that, and then we've incorporated other things into our way of being, and now how do we bring all three together again in a new context in a very credible way? And I think that's something that is one thing that I miss when I read. I get a lot of strength when I encounter, and I think is a way that is still open for us to be creative in the 21st century. And then I think one of the most positive changes in my time is kind of removing or stripping away the myth of Ignatius. Again, some of these older presentations were very idealistic. And through a lot of great critical research on him, we're able to recover what was real, strip away what was not, and then figure out where was development that was put back on Ignatius, and how can we still take these insights but not say, well, Ignatius had to say that. And I think that's a really good thing for being a credible witness to the lives of the saints and to our order in the 21st century. So with that, I'll pass.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. We have like 6-7 minutes, no more than that. But if anyone would like to ask any question, now will be the moment.
Thanks for the presentations, guys. It was really interesting. Ignatius had to deal with the question of whether there should be a women's version or branch of the Jesuits. He said no, and that was very much a factor of his context. We're now in a church that's beginning to recognize the equality of men and women and the gifts of women to the church. Do you think there ought to be a women's branch of the Jesuits?
Thank you for an easy question.
Paul will answer that now. Okay.
I think this will be a very interesting question for the society to talk about. Having said that, thanks be to God, there are already wonderful women's groups that pretty much follow the Jesuit constitutions. Some of them going way back, and some of them even more recent in times. So in part, we have to hear from the women whether they whether they would want that kind of affiliation. I mean, the fact that other religious orders have a branch for women and have third orders, which is kind of a more secular form of the order, that isn't necessarily the way forward, it seems to me. So,
I'll add a little to that, and because of that experience of Ignatius, basically accepting at least one or maybe two women in the society, they funded a number of projects that he was involved in. I would have to say, as historically, we would take a huge jump to get. He eventually said, we're not going to have any more women in the society. I think administratively, our Constitution's kind of set. Administratively, I think it would be an enormous leap, to kind of have women enter. I'd say is that the kind of things, though, that you're kind of speaking to in terms of collaboration, in terms of working with women in an active way. The Madams of the Sacred Heart come to mind as kind of the archetypal example. Their spirituality is almost entirely Ignatian spirituality. And to be working cooperatively with them in a structure which fits them, I think is perhaps the best way, so that collaboration is really the mode forward. I think administratively it would be extremely difficult. And the reason I say that is because there are women's orders and men's orders that are very close, but they actually are separate, and they're kind of joined at the historical moment of creation, and then kind of diverge from that. And that's how I would answer that question.
Great.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. And I've benefited from hey, John. John was a brilliant student in my Greek class. Hard to keep up with him. But the thing is that I noted, as an observer, because I've been with Jesuits and I benefited my entire life from associations with you, is the genius of St. Ignatius in his adaptation to modernity, as opposed to many religious orders seem medieval. And many parts of the church might seem archaic, but not the Jesuits. And I wonder, wherein is the genius of Ignatius? How did he do this? Like, it's so in tune with post-modernity, as opposed to feeling, well, this is archaic, this is medieval. That's the thing that strikes me. It's amazing. Amazing.
I think one way to answer that question, there's a phrase, I don't remember where Ignatius coins this, but he says, this is the way things will be done. unless it seems better in the spirit. And I think that last phrase, and it's phrased a couple different ways, keeps our charism open to an unhealthy rigidity. I think structure is important, otherwise things just collapse, but I think it becomes rigid and lifeless. I think that's a challenge. And so I think that phrase has always, I've experienced it where I'm missioned or how I'm missioned, where it's like, well, this is what scholastics do, but in this case, this is what we'll do. Or this is where Jesuits work, but it's fine for you to be sent here. And so you see that, and that, of course, then enriches us when those guys come back from those places to bring their experiences on the frontiers or new ministries, which then helps us stay more open and alive to where the Spirit's going. So I think in our spirituality, that's one reason why you've seen us adapt. So, yeah.
One last question. Last question.
Since Francis was elected Pope, have you seen any changes either in the society or in the church as a whole that maybe show his Jesuit influence?
One subtle change, I think, is, and I could be totally off base on this, but this is what I think I've seen, is that where in years past the general of the society was the one we looked to immediately, and we still do look to our general. But the fact that you now have a Jesuit Pope, there's a slight shift there that you're also looking a lot at the Pope because you know he's a Jesuit. Yeah.
I asked Tom Rees, who was the former editor of America magazine, a couple weeks after Francis's election, and I said, why did the cardinal, he's a sociologist, he was a reporter in Rome, and he really knows the Roman scene. He did a book on the kind of the archbishops, and so he has a real sense of it. And I asked him, I said, why do you think Francis was named Pope? And he, without hesitation, said to me, he said, because he thought that many of the cardinals thought that Francis Bergoglio would correct the society and bring it into line more with the church. Discipline us. I don't mind telling you that there were many people in Rome, in the Jesuit Curia, when Francis was named Pope, of the great kind of anxiety that they had, because there seemed to be an alienation. That seemed to be an alienation was not true. I think that Francis Bergoglio loved the society and saw serving the church a little differently. He admits very early on in that long interview with America magazine, he made some mistakes. In many ways, I think Francis is a real Jesuit. He has some hard times and he learns from them. And he tries to do the best he can do, particularly with the power and position that he has. It's always, I think, a really important thing. And I think he has loved the society, not only years ago, but also today. He could have changed the society. He has absolute power to do so. And I think what he has done is encourage the society to serve the church in the many ways that it has and can do in the future. And so I think, Francis, it's funny, some people have always said, who would have ever thought that he was defending people from the right? That Francis, people back in Argentina who saw him as a conservative, he said, there are people to his right that are beating up on him. We never thought we would see this. Church is a big tent. And I'm just grateful that he seems to be a very good leader. And one of the things that he does is that sense of reconciliation amongst people and trying to get people to see God face to face.
Yeah, and just real quick, so I've been alive for 3 papacies, JP2, Benedict, and Francis, and in my opinion, they're all wonderful. But what I notice when I look at Francis' official documents, his encyclicals, he front loads images way more. Go read his homilies, look at Amoris Laetitia. The footnote gets a lot of traffic. Read those first 2 chapters. He calls the images of the family today. first the biblical image and then the current modern image. And that's really key. And I see that Jesuit influence in him because Ignatius was very interested in baptizing the imagination. Imagination was a gift from God that can be misused or used well. And so I think you see Francis trying to engage the imagination with these images, and keep an eye on that when he writes. You see it best in his homilies, but all of his big documents, these images are there, not to the exclusion that the other popes weren't doing that. They were, but he, I think, does it a little bit more, and I think that's a real influence from his training.
Wonderful. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Paul, our veteran old Jesuit, our middle-aged Thai, and our young John,
Baby,
for this wonderful presentation. As always, you have some cards on top of the table. Feel free to take one. There will be more coming. We have more talks coming. The next talk will be in 2 weeks. So I know it's pretty soon. It's Tuesday, November 16, here as well. So it will be with Simone Kotba, who is a professor at Cambridge University in UK. And she will discuss about effort and grace in the spiritual exercises. So if you are interested with that and some food, come if you can, and if I hope to see you everybody, okay? So, bye.
Thank you.